Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My name is Jessica Gedamu and I'm the VP Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for Springer Nature. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by John Amaechi for this In Conversation session. So let me quickly introduce my guest. John is an organizational psychologist and he's the founder of APS Intelligence. He is also a chartered scientist, an elected fellow of the Royal Society for Public Health, and a best-selling New York Times author. And I know John because he and his colleagues at APS supported us in the development of our internal DI strategy in 2019, and we've worked together multiple times since then. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I'm glad that people we work with still want to talk to me. It's a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. We love to. No, thanks so much for joining us today. And John, I'd love to start today by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do with organizations.
I am, start with the obvious, I suppose. I'm extremely large. People can't tell because we're trapped in little boxes, but I'm extremely large. I played sport once and upon a time, and now I do more important, valuable, hopefully purposeful things. I'm a psychologist by training. I started off as a marriage and family therapist, actually. And then I think when I was young, I didn't realize the kind of psychology that I do existed. Like most professions, what's possible expands, and now I find myself in, sometimes embedded in businesses that I never thought I would understand anything about. Your sector, for sure, one where I think lay people externally,
Mhm.
even those of us who rely on the work that you do to do our work, we don't necessarily know the intricacies of how it works. So it's this fascinating job where I get to do my job whilst also, in order to do it well, having to learn about the organizations and the people within them that we work with. So it's truly fascinating. It's not just me; it's me, and we have a team of 20 people or so. We're only tiny, but and we like to say that we are weird and wonderful because we are. We're an odd collection of people in the best possible way, who challenge each other and support each other and we each make each other think just a little bit harder and I think better. So that's who I am and that's who we are.
That sounds wonderful. And it's such a wonderful description of your team and how you speak about that. Um, how do you support organizations? Like, how do you work with them?
So it's interesting because we have been on a bit of a transition here because when we first started, and I hope this is not unique to me and my organization, but we thought we just needed to tell people what to do and the context that they existed in is not important. This is what you need to do. And obviously that meets with resistance, but it also says that you're not really very empathetic. And so now we partner with people and say, look, here's the art of the possible. Here's what we can do. What do you want to be true in X number of years' time? And here's how we can help you get there. And we may not always think the ambition is as grand as it needs to be, but we now partner with people. And what we found is that we are able to help people to exceed what they thought possible through advisory services, through some of the work we
Hmm.
did with you. It's not like you guys didn't know about strategy and other stuff, but we just augmented and challenged and brought some things that maybe weren't thought of to the table. And you brought that massive knowledge to it. And then we built something that I think together was better. So we do that a lot with organizations. And then increasingly helping very senior people and leaders broadly who are managing this strange transition that's happened because the expectations of leadership has shifted, and it's
Hmm.
not just because of the pandemic, and it's not just because young people are entitled, which is something that leaders do tell me every once in a while, but it's not that. It's that we are promising more and more as workplaces. I went on your website before this conversation to look at your careers page
Right.
at some of the statements
Yeah.
that are made about the experience that people can expect no matter where you are within the organization, no matter your geography. And that right there, these are promises made on behalf of managers who have to deliver on those promises. And maybe they grew up and in their early working days were in an environment where that was never the case. They were just project managers, resource movers. But now leaders have to be so much more if we want to be successful. So that's the kind of work we're doing, helping people, because I think most people want to be the kind of leader that's admired
Hmm.
and is inspirational and people want to work for, but helping them to get there just the way they are, not changing them into another type of person, but just the way they are.
Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, speaking about kind of developing leadership and getting better as organizations. I think, I mean, we worked specifically together in kind of becoming a more inclusive organization. And as a publisher, when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, we look at it from these three perspectives within our company, within our communities, and within our content. And we know that increasing representation and um, including more diverse voices in these three areas allows us to create better content and better research. And also, we feel that we have a role to play because we're at the heart of this huge network of researchers and educators. And I mean, just when we look at the numbers, we work with 90,000 editors, 750,000 peer reviewers, and we have more than 1 million research subscription per year. And so we feel that we also have a responsibility in championing DI in these communities. And I think that's a bit of the why DI is really important for us to achieve our mission of opening doors to discovery. Why would you say more broadly do organizations address DI and why is it a business imperative?
I don't know. Do all organizations do this in the same way? I think lots of organizations look at one element of the three strands you talked about,
Hmm.
and they say that's our responsibility, maybe as those who are contractually employed to us, not necessarily customers, or
Right.
it's different in your environment, but that sense of the
Hmm.
external stakeholders are not necessarily as important. So that's one of the ways that I think you have made a more integrated approach to this. Springer Nature has made a more integrated approach to this that has more chance of delivering, because as you mentioned, all of these parts feed into the other
Hmm. Yeah.
in a cascade effect. I tire of talking to people about the performance prerogative of inclusion.
Hmm.
It's so dull to have these conversations because not because I don't think it's important, because of course I want to help people win. I'm not here for the kumbaya, for the moments of sitting around and nice chats with lots of people who are different per se. I want to help organizations win and thrive and create opportunities that are equality of opportunity. And the data there is so pervasive. There's 30 years worth of meta-analysis, and much of the amusing part was when working with you, much of the data that we use was from your own journals. Um, so there is this depth, this rich depth of amazing insights that should tell everybody this is important, not to be nice to the black person, not to be nice to the immigrant, not to be nice to the person with a disability or the queer person, or name that person. But in order for us to deliver on our mission as fulsomely as possible, there is something amazing that happens when you are surrounded by people and you know that because we all have aspects of ourselves that we can't see, blind spots, for want of a better word, there's something so reassuring that knowing that your blind spot will not just be covered because of the presence of somebody else, but somebody else will proactively act to try and support you by never letting you be surprised. You'll never publish something, a word will never leak out because somebody will spot and know that
Right.
this is not the way. It's so reassuring, as well as the fact that we've seen the compounding impact on all different kinds of performance metrics, whether it's innovation or engagement or all these other things, by having inclusive teams. And it's really important. We're not talking, we had this conversation a long time ago, we're not just talking about the presence of difference.
Right.
Because the presence of difference has never meant access to the brilliance of difference. That brilliance, that access to brilliance comes when people know that they can share themselves with the people around them without fear that they will become demeaned or or ridiculed or run out of town for who they are. That's why this works. Performance prerogative.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I think there is this narrative around, so what is the business case for diversity? Why is it important to make companies better? How do we benefit from that? And then kind of discussed as a separate issue, like, oh, and there's also a moral case. But I think these two really are so interlinked and we cannot separate them and we cannot talk about only one or the other. It doesn't make sense. Um,
Yeah, there's the personal benefit too.
yeah.
I mean, who of us, in whatever country you're in, who of us doesn't value at least some component that's now just a part of your life that is actually a richness brought to you by another, an
Right. Yeah.
outsider? Whether it's, a type of food or a type of music or an aspect of music that you listen to that you don't even know. Our richness in our life is brought by this idea of the introduction of new things that color, change, and shift how we think, operate, and enjoy life. And I just would add one more thing. I think that we need to start challenging people who say, "What's the evidence?" Because there is so much evidence, and it is so easily available. In
Mhm.
part because you and, in fairness, other organizations have made sure, but it's you first, have made sure that there is open access to the data that's required. And then there's all those studies that have been done in situ in professional services across the world, in oil and gas companies, in you name it. Almost every sector has got somebody who's done properly integrated, evidence-based study into this. It works. Let's stop asking about it and Google it, or go on your open
Or
source, right?
exactly go into one of our databases and find the evidence. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think the point that you mentioned, just also the reassurance that when we have diverse perspectives in the room, somebody will spot something that I am not aware of. Like even in my team, that's something that I see that I think is really reassuring. So I completely agree with that. That's a really good point. I wanted to pick up on something that you also mentioned, and I guess to some extent that is, I don't know, that is part of how organizations benefit from diversity, because you spoke about retention. And so one of the things, for example, that we're doing is we're trying to, well, we're working towards collecting more and better data to help us understand where we are as an organization and to then develop data-driven change interventions from that. And so looking internally, we've now for the second time run our inclusion survey this year. And the findings were really insightful, just generally to understand the differences in the lived experiences of inclusion of different groups. But one data point that I found really interesting was that people who were part of an employee network had an overall higher experience of inclusion. And so I was wondering, like, in your view, how does an inclusive organization link with these broader issues of engagement and retention and recruitment and culture more broadly? So what role does inclusion play there?
So networks, employee resource groups,
Hmm.
all the different names we
Yeah.
have for them, they're supposed to evolve over time to a point where they cease to exist, not because the thing that they bring to the table is not required, but because it's so ubiquitous
Hmm.
across the organization that that people who might have ordinarily gone to a network event or a network, a room full of people who are like-minded, don't need to anymore, because everywhere they go they find that embracing, belonging feeling. The reason that My conjecture is that the reason that people who are part of networks feel more a sense of belonging is because around them they create a group of people not who are like them. People always make this mistake. Networks aren't just full of people who are
Hmm.
all the same.
Right.
The idea that all women everywhere, you're a global organization.
Yeah.
The idea that all women everywhere somehow have this magic commonality, or all black people everywhere. It's like that's not it. In the same way that not all German speakers have this commonality, and not all people from the Netherlands are the same. what it is that you can go into a room where you recognize the one characteristic that you do have in common, even if it's expressed differently, will never be used to wound you.
Right.
So your brain is free. All that energy that we normally reserve, most of us know what it's like when we walk in a room. Almost everybody, this is a straight, white, cisgendered man, all the way through to the most different person you might imagine. We all know the sensation of walking into a room and for whatever reason having this gulp, this sense of, oh, there be dragons here.
Right. Yeah.
And and your brain is not great at doing some high level, high order stuff while you're worrying about what's going to happen to me. Is somebody going to say something mean? I don't belong here. The rumination in your brain makes you stupid, or at least not as clever as you should be. And yet, when they enter these spaces, they enter a place where they can still be held to account for saying something stupid or having a wrong idea or whatever, but they will not be maligned or made fun of because of that characteristic that they often find compromises them in broader environments. This is what we want from everybody, right?
Right.
I gave some very robust feedback to a colleague of mine today who built a session that I didn't think hit the spot. And we talked about it robustly. This can't go forward. We can't put this in front of clients. But here's what we're going to learn from this. And so we want to create environments where people can be held accountable, can be robustly challenged, can be given feedback, but what they won't do is feel unsafe because they happen to be an immigrant, because they happen to speak with an accent that's not the right, whatever that is, one, who's gay or who's whatever else. That's what we can do. And so I'm not surprised that people in networks find themselves feeling more engaged and probably safer and happier because of their existence.
Yeah. And so, kind of going off of that, saying that creating this environment in which people feel that they belong, if we do that throughout the organization, that then also plays into retention and engagement more broadly. If we take it beyond the networks, if the networks are not needed anymore, is that, do I understand you correctly?
You did indeed. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
This is about psychological safety, right? This is
Hmm.
about, you know, part of being in those spaces where people have one element of themselves that is broadly common is this idea that relationship building can become much more intentional. Because although men don't always realize this, women don't like women because they're women. Women choose friends, and they can put aside that element and say, now I need to understand what you're all about. What are your interests? What are your principles? What floats your boat?
Right.
And you can have that properly intentional relationship building without people thinking that it's just this one characteristic that's the defining element of you.
Yeah.
It's quite reassuring.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been working with many, many organizations across the globe. What changes do you see in how large international organizations address or work towards DEI?
A ton of them, so many. So a ton of different changes. So there's a narrative change. We're starting to see people talk about D&I more in the way that they talk about ESG. So
Hmm.
not as an added extra, wouldn't this be nice to have, which is how people talk about D&I, but people recognize right now with a new regulatory environment, with the true personal and community peril that's at stake, and many other reasons, this becomes now a market influencing thing.
Right.
And so people are integrating it more into the mainstream. So it's part of every conversation about everything in sales, in all the different areas. And that's important. That integration stops it from being a nice to have, which tends to mean it disappears when budgets get
Mm.
tight or people get bored. So that's one thing. The other thing is that people are starting to recognize that organizational structures and processes and procedures have to change, but it's not enough. They're starting to recognize that it has to be a real compulsion for colleagues to build skills and knowledge, not just awareness,
Right.
because that used to be the thing
Yeah.
with D&I. just awareness. But there's a wonderful woman, and she's published in you publish her, as well as others. But Susan Mickey, Professor Susan
Hmm.
Mickey, she's a health psychologist in Britain. She's amazing. She's just incredible. And she talks about the elements required for behavior change, and two of them are knowledge and capabilities. And so more and more organizations are starting to realize that they have to build knowledge. That's not just awareness, it's proper, integrated, deep knowledge of difference. And then skills. How do you intervene when you see non-optimal behavior? How do you build intentional relationships with people who are different than you? How do you lead groups of people who are diverse and different, whether it be because of the language they speak or the geography or anything else? And that intentional skill building and knowledge building is allowing for the experience of people to be much better.
Yeah.
And then there's the teeth of it, sanction and audit. Sanction and audit,
Right.
right? If you're not willing to be the kind of colleague and leader that our values state you should be, then you're going to be audited. We're going to check to see if that's happening. Are there differential levels of attrition in your team for different types of people? And then we're going to sanction at some stage down the line, because not everybody's coming to this willingly.
Yeah, I see. I see. Interesting. I mean, I think for that, it's also, I mean, being able to kind of have that kind of data is really something that probably many organizations are still working towards. At least for us, I know that's something to kind of that we're still working on, kind of collecting the data and being able to track careers and to see not only what experiences do people have, but also how do they move throughout the organizations. Um,
This is a problem that many British-centered and American-centered companies never have to consider,
right.
because the gathering of data, although disclosure rates are low
Yeah.
in lots of places, the gathering of data is certainly not illegal or
Right.
disallowed. But I have been working with a colleague actually from another organization on pulling together legally allowable ways of
Hmm.
gathering data that's just a bit more creative than than we might have traditionally used, to try and get the same sets of data that would have different labels perhaps,
Hmm.
but would allow us to still understand on the preponderance of probability whether certain groups are having differential experiences from others.
Yeah.
So there are ways around it,
Yeah.
and but it's hot, as you
Yeah.
know. It's a challenge because you've got to engage legal, you've
Right.
got to engage
Yeah.
HR, and everybody's got to feel happy. But
Yeah.
this is one of those things where I think we've all got to feel a little bit uncomfortable to get it done.
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also the point that you made on building the skill, the skill for inclusion, I think also is something that we're trying to do in integrating that into processes, into both training, but also in development, to kind of yeah, also set people up for success in building that skill, and something that we want to do more work on, certainly. Um, I mentioned earlier, and maybe yeah, just like as a last question, I mentioned earlier that we're at the heart of this global network of researchers and educators, and that we have this role in championing DI in these communities. We also consider it our responsibility to publish ethical research and making sure that those involved in producing research are treated correctly, but also that the end result doesn't cause harm. We take this very seriously, and we've introduced policies on some of these specific issues. So, for example, Nature recently introduced a new approach to address the practice of helicopter research and ethics dumping in global collaborations. At the same time, we're publishers and not gatekeepers, and getting the balance right between influencing the research and education communities positively, but not controlling them, can be challenging, especially as we're committed to serving the needs of the research community. So this relationship works both ways. We need to listen and advise, but not dictate. So I'm really interested in your view, like when we consider DI and our influence as an organization, how far should we extend that? So, for example, into our supply chain or other wider community.
anytime I engage in an endeavor,
Hmm.
whether I am the final component that pushes whatever it is out into the world, or whether I'm buried deep inside as some hidden part, I always realize that I am connected by a thread. My ethics are connected by a thread to the final product. And that means they are connected by a thread to whatever harm, whatever misinformation, whatever other thing is spread because of this. You, I was going to say you can't imagine, but you absolutely can imagine how many times I have thrown in my face a provocatively worded summary, provocatively worded on purpose because that's the only way the media takes interest, that actually mischaracterizes the in-depth analysis of the data and the research.
Hmm.
And especially where it comes to race, on a weekly basis, somebody will cite me a piece of data, and it's not they've not read they wouldn't know how to read the entire journal article. But what they have done is read the summary that was published by a right-wing newspaper
Hmm.
often, or even not, right, who just takes this because it must be right, because you lot are so clever and you're scientists, so you shouldn't lie to us. And they don't realize that what they've taken is this summary that's designed to attract attention because we're all so desperate for our work to be seen, not just published, but to be spread.
Right.
It's amazing how we've become like TikTokers. We want our work to be viral. And I'm
Yeah.
not surprised, right? After 10 years of diligent research, you want what you've produced, or 2 years, or even 1 year, you want what you've produced together. All I would just encourage everybody to consider is that you are not divorced from the harm. When I speak, and people imagine me quite provocative, I think, at times, there is no syllable I utter that I have not considered the potential impact of. I recognize that sometimes that will mean that what I say will disappoint some of my audience who wished that I had pushed. But I recognize that I am in a position of power,
Hmm.
and power without, in some sense, power without accountability, because I can fire a word off into the ether. This is just within your organization, perhaps, or within your broader, wider organization and stakeholders. But sometimes I can go on the news in Britain and send off a message to the entire country. And I recognize that if my words cause somebody to fall into a depressive bout, to harm someone in their house, or I'm divorced from that impact, but I still know it's me. So I think about it. I know you're not the gatekeepers, but we are known by the company we keep.
Right.
That is always the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think these are really, yeah, I think that's a really important message, and I think that's also very much in line with how we see our responsibility, yeah, at the center of this network. Thank you so much, John, for this really interesting and insightful conversation. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Always, Jessica. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.